Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today, 12th of May, 2024, we're going to hear about the book Lewd, Women and Wicked Witches by Marianne Hester, and it's being discussed by Dorothea Annison. So over to you, Dorothea.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here again. I'm Dorothea. I'm based in the UK. And I'm going to talk about this book that was published in 1992. If we get the next slide up, you'll be able to see a photograph of Marianne Hester, who wrote the book. This was her PhD thesis. It was published in 1992. Since then, she's continued to work in academia. She's now Emerita Professor at Bristol University and was the head of the Centre for Gender and Violence Research. And she's continued to sort of research and publish within the area of male violence against women on subjects such as domestic abuse and coercive control, tackling perpetrators. So I discovered this book quite recently. It was when I heard Marianne talk at the Philia conference in Glasgow in 2023, introducing a session that was on different aspects of witch hunts. And I thought it sounded really interesting that I would get it and read it, which I did. I've been interested in witches and how that impacts women for many years. And I mean, the witch hunts have been a topic for several feminist writers, including Mary Daly. And the whole concept of witches obviously continue to permeate our culture in all sorts of ways. The number of, books, fairy tales, films that have witches in them is enormous. Sites of witch hunts, such as Pendle and Salem, are now tourist destinations full of tap that you can buy. On a more positive note, there's campaigns such as that in Scotland to have memorials for women who were killed as witches. And of course, being a witch is a chosen spiritual practice for women. So it's still there. And in some places in the world, women are still persecuted as witches. I read something recently about women in Bangladesh that when their husbands are killed by tigers, and the reason that deaths by tigers are going up is to do with climate change and pressure on resources and all these things. They are blamed and they're ostracized and, have a really terrible life afterwards. And despite the damage that these stereotypes can do to women, within feminism, some women use sort of witch imagery and memes, talk about what's happening to us as a witch hunt and come up with their slogans like, this witch doesn't burn. So to go back to the book, I want to emphasize the subtitle of the book, A Study of the Dynamics of Male Domination. And that is essentially, she's using the witch hunts as an example of male domination and how it impacts us. And once, looks at that, using particularly a revolutionary feminist analysis. She was one of a group of women, including Sheila Jeffreys, that developed ideas of revolutionary feminism. And so the first half is quite theoretical, the first half of the book is quite theoretical, looking at theories of women's oppression and why radical and revolutionary feminism are the best explanations of that. And so there's a clear quote that I've put up here. That's on page 1. So she's setting out her sort of principles at the start. It is within the constructs of male and female sexualities that we may observe the central dynamic of male domination over women. In the context of male supremacy, male and female sexualities are constructed as specifically different and unequal. So one of her aims in writing the book was to respond to the criticism that radical feminism is essentialist or universalist, that it's got a sort of single unchanging concept of men and women and oppression, and it fails to account for specific cultural and historical aspects of oppression. She uses the example of witch hunts in England from the 16th and 17th century to show how revolutionary feminism can be used to understand and explain why women were the target. And I like it because it is a theoretical approach to women's history. It's not just here's some women that did great things in the past, which is very positive. Yeah, I do like to read those sorts of books. But, it's analysing how ordinary women were living in the past and how male domination and male violence impacted their lives then, just as it does today. And she uses the witch hunts as the vast majority of the accused were women, and she sees it as an example of how sexual politics worked out at a time of great social and economic change. So the crucial point is that male domination appears to be natural, but it's not. Men actively perpetrate it, and including by the use of violence, and that's specifically sexual violence. So it's essential to analyse sexuality to understand how men control women. And this includes the eroticisation of dominance and submission, so that male power and the objectification of women becomes sexy, which is what makes male supremacy unique and especially enduring. And one of the clearest examples of this is pornography. If we have the next slide, because pornography is primarily about men and the empowerment of men. Women are the means to such male empowerment, and women as fetish especially so. And it's a clear example of the eroticization of inequality. Women are very often portrayed as being, assaulted, raped, well, we know. And so male domination persists over time, but it changes. And the persistent features are the social constructs of masculinity and femininity, which take different characteristics in different times and places. But there's always the underlying threat of violence to maintain and enforce male control. So an example of changes is, that she does refer to in this book is Sheila Jeffrey's work that was discussed last week, looking at the early 20th century sexologists and how their work was used to tell women how they had to submit to male demands sexually, and to create a new idea of a woman that would be happy to take part in penetration and not challenge this and just put up with it whether or not she wanted to do it or enjoyed it. And now pornography is what tells us what to do. And things come from pornography, like the idea of choking, that are very risky and dangerous, but seem to have become normalized as part of sex, and it's everywhere around us. So this adaptability enables the persistence of male supremacy. Yes, times change, and the ways that male control is enforced change. So yeah, the next quote of that put there: male violence against women is a crucial mechanism by which male dominance and control is maintained over women. By some men using violence against some women, all women at the same time live with the threat of violence from potentially any man, and all men benefit from the actions of some men. And that was a crucial point that was developed from the feminist work on male violence against women in the 70s and 80s, where taking practical steps to assist women, like rape crisis centres and women's aid refuges, raised awareness of the extent of male violence, how many were affected, how it worked out in women's lives, and that then fed into the development of theory. So, for instance, when she's discussing part of the discussion of male violence, she's discussing work that was published by the London Rape Crisis Centre. So it's based on their conversations with women about what happened and how they understood what happened to them. So we then, that leads to the development of what you might call the sort of basic tenet of radical feminism, that women are a sex class, there's conflict between women and men, and that women's subordination is enforced by male violence. It's the oldest and fundamental oppression. So if we have the next slide, please. As I said, Marianne Hester was one of a group of women that developed the concept of revolutionary feminism, absolutely focusing on the construction of male sexuality as crucial to male domination. And so she looking at things like rape. So she discusses the work of Brown, Miller and McKinnon on rape. And Brown Miller sees rape as violence, although she does obviously recognise its power. She's the source of that, rape is all men keeping all women in a state of fear. But Hester, like Mackinnon, sees rape as sex. And there's a quote from Mackinnon: "Rape is a sex crime that is not a crime when it looks like sex." And that's the point, that rape is often difficult to separate from what so-called normal sex. And so we know there's such, low prosecution and conviction rates. How do we clearly distinguish between so-called consensual and non-consensual sex when we live in a culture that tells women to be passive and unable to say no, where men assume that no means yes? And how do women prove non-consent without evidence of violence? But the whole idea of consent is flawed because it assumes that women have free choice and the power to refuse, ignoring manipulation, threats of violence, cultural expectations. So male sexuality is constructed so as to control women socially, acted out in heterosexual relationships, as well as in rape, pornography, and other forms of male sexual violence against women. So it's problematizing heterosexual relationships generally, not just the extreme manifestations like pornography and rape. Pornography, again, she makes the social construction of desire based on the eroticization of dominance and submission. So revolutionary feminism sees heterosexuality as a political institution crucial to upholding male dominance. It appears to be normal and natural, but it's actually used to coerce women into oppressive relationships. So that is the quotes there that sort of set out that. So heterosexuality must be recognised as a political institution whereby male sexuality, constructed as the primary and usually penetrative sexuality, serves as social control of women in the interests of men. Excuse me, I just need a... So if we move on to the next slide, I'll move on now to the actual witch hunts. And I would say that I think the half of the book where she does cover the theoretical things, it was a really good summary and introduction to the development of these ideas, and it's a really clear explanation of them. So she then moves on to look at the early modern witch hunts. And early modern, it means the sort of 16th and 17th century. The witch hunts weren't really a medieval phenomenon so much. Some women were targeted as witches in that period, but it was often that they were religious heretics, or it was just a way of getting rid of inconvenient women. I mean, Joan of Arc being a prime example, whose crimes were actually political. She led a rebel French army against the English that were occupying France at the time, but it was convenient to portray her as a witch because she was transgressing the sort of sex stereotypes and expectations of the time by being active, by leading an army, and the main charge that they used against her, wearing men's clothes. But in the medieval period, if a woman was seen as a witch within a village, she would be targeted by a mob, and she may be beaten up. She may lose her life to a lynch mob at times, but it didn't involve this legal and state apparatus. And this is what is different in this period, as I'll go on to say. So the early modern period, just to try and visualize it, it's the Tudors and Stuarts, it's Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, it's the Cavaliers and Roundheads and the Civil War in the UK. It's the time of European colonisation of North America. So it's the time that the Mayflower set out and the first colonies were. So that's the period that we're looking at. But it was a time of major social change. Economic, political, legal, religious factors all led into this. The witch hunts were most extensive in Central Europe, especially Germany, and they also took place in Scotland and Scandinavia, as well as England. There probably weren't as many in England. It wasn't as extensive as it was in some parts of Germany, where far more women were targeted. And there was a widespread belief in witches, magic, and the devil amongst people at that time. And any misfortune could be attributed to magic or witches. Um, so, so what were the social and economic factors in 16th and 17th century England that enabled the witch hunts? So there was a shift in religion from Catholic to Protestant, and certainly in England, the law and administration shifted from control of the church to control of a secular state, still male controlled, of course, very crucially. There was the shift in power from a monarch to the parliament. Changes in agriculture, which would, of course, be the things that affected ordinary people the most. Enclosure of land, which was taking common lands and open fields away from the peasants that had farmed them for centuries by landlords. And many of the people lost their land in the process. And she says women were particularly affected by the loss of common land, because that's what land that anybody could use to graze any animals that you had, to collect firewood, things like that. And so the loss of that for women made a lot of them a lot poorer. But this is the start of this is the key point for the shift from feudalism to capitalism, the increase in wage labour rather than subsistence farming. And because of that, there was a large growth in the number of poor people, which led to tensions within communities, because local parishes were expected to provide some kind of what they call poor relief. And so if the numbers reliant on that increased, then that obviously was an impact on the wealthier members of that community, who would have to pay more taxes, which obviously they weren't happy about. And therefore, poor women in particular could become a target. Other things that affected women were loss of potential income. A lot of women were able to make some money by brewing. Beer was a very common drink, and it could be done in a household and then sold. And they brought in licensing and tax changes that stopped that, and it became more controlled, and it became a men-only job. Men were more likely to be able to take advantage of the new sort of landowning and wage earning opportunities. Because of the falling wages and poverty, it was difficult to marry for lower class people. The marriage age went up to the late 20s. And given that women are so often forced to rely on men for any kind of economic support, that is obviously bad for women. Well, good or bad. But it meant that women were poor, increasingly reliant on charity, begging, that sort of thing. So these were leading to conflicts between men and women for resources. It's a time of major social change. You can see on the slides I've put where the quotes, time of major social change, existing social structures, beliefs and relationships were undergoing transformations, including men's and women's roles. And the witch hunts were an attempt at maintaining and restoring male supremacy within this context. And the witch hunts provided one means of controlling women socially within a male. Oh, I've got a chat box come up, I can't read it. Male supremacy society using violence or the threat of violence and relying on a particular construct of female sexuality. Now, the picture I've put there is the front of one of the pamphlets that I'm going to talk about, which is what Marianne Hester based her research on, and their accounts of the trials of some of the witches. And so the various illustrations that I'm going to have on the slides are taken from the pamphlets published around the time. So it kind of shows what images were used of women at the time. The strange looking creature at the bottom there is the hairy dog that one of the women I'm going to talk about was accused of using to bewitch and harm one of her neighbours. So it said the focus is particularly on witch trials in Essex in England, and that's because of the existence of more complete court records and popular pamphlets with information about the accusations made against women. Just to give a bit of context, in Elizabethan Essex, witchcraft was the third most common crime after theft and burglary, and was the main crime that was committed by women. So around 1,000 women were executed from 1542, which is when the first law specifically against witchcraft was passed in England, to when that law was repealed in 1736. Many more were convicted and imprisoned, and many more were accused of witches, but it didn't come to trial. And another thing, in England, witches were hanged; they weren't burnt. That was the thing that was done on the in Germany and in Scotland, but not in England. And it was only witches that were found guilty of killing someone by witchcraft who were executed. If you used witchcraft for lesser things like destroying somebody's livestock, the sentence was imprisonment. So we'll have the next slide, please. So what were the ideas and expectations about women at this time? Because one of the things, when looking at male violence and the witch hunts, using the revolutionary feminism, is having a look at how male sexuality and male ideas of women's sexuality impact women at the time. And so the definition of the witch relied on an eroticized construct of female behavior, with women as potentially threatening and in need of control. Throughout most of the witch hunt period, female sexuality was constructed as more active than male sexuality, in contrast to the 20th century. As today, male and female sexuality, as well as masculinity and femininity, were perceived as both different and unequal, with men as superior. And that, was still very much based on the biblical story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, where Eve was blamed for bringing sin into the world because she was tempted by the serpent. And this was used to label all women as inherently sinful, as sexually insatiable, and as easily tempted by the devil, and that they bore the curse of Eve, which was to suffer in childbirth and to be subject to their husbands. So that's how women were seen: sexually insatiable, prone to sin, and easily tempted by the devil. So you can easily see how it was very easy to label women as witches when that's what you think all women are like. But there was also changes at this time. Ideas about marriage were changing, because for the Catholics, marriage was a necessary evil. Sorry about this. For them, all sex was sinful, and marriage was just for those who weren't able to be celibate and because of the necessity of procreating children. Protestants saw marriage and family in a more positive light as the foundation of a Christian community, as a place to raise children and instruct them in religion and how to be, good church-going citizens. But the man was still the head of the family, and he had the spiritual responsibility for his wife and children. And the ideal woman was then passive, domestic, dutiful, and submissive. So it's a change in the idea of women and their behaviour and what women should be. From sort of quite active and threatening and powerful, which is powerful, she can kill you, to very passive, very submissive, and very domesticated. Now, one of the things that Marianne Hester does is looks at the various explanations for the witch hunts that have been given. And these have included religious conflict, the persecution of folk religion, the rise of male-dominated science and medicine, mass hysteria, and the invention of printing. And she says none of these explicitly explain why witch hunting was woman hunting. Certainly the stereotypes of the witch could easily fit certain women who weren't under patriarchal control and weren't obeying the patriarchal ideals of appropriate female behaviour. And so it was used as a form of public control of women who were outside private control. So is the target witches who happen to be women, or is it women who happen to be witches? So that's always the question. So she does look at some of the feminist writers on witchcraft and about the strengths and weaknesses of their points of view. I mean, one of the very famous works on the witch hunts and women as witches that I think women referring to in the chat was Marianne English's book, Witches, Healers and Midwives, which was very popular and very influential. And yeah, I remember reading it, and it was a revelation, because it was showing women as skilled and knowledgeable, and how men attacked them for that. But Hester questions that analysis as to whether that is actually the root cause of the witch hunts. The thesis of Marianne English's book is that as medicine was established as a profession with university training, which was obviously only available to men at that time, there was a drive to get rid of the competition from women healers by accusing them of witchcraft. Now, Hester says that this focus is too narrow, and also that the timescales are wrong, because the replacement of midwives by male doctors happened more in the 18th century, which was after the witch hunts had ended. And actually, one of the main proponents of a male-only medical profession in England, William Harvey, was also opposed to witch hunts on rational and scientific grounds. And she says he influenced a decline in prosecutions in the reign of Charles I. So she doesn't agree with that thesis. She also doesn't agree that witches were women that were practicing a pre-Christian or pagan faith. She says the main evidence for that was falsified. I know there's some researchers like Max Dashu that do find those traces, but so I'm not qualified to comment really. So I'll stick with what Marianne Hester says at the moment. And then, of course, Mary Daly wrote about the witch hunts in gynecology as an example of the CEDAW ritual syndrome, which has been used against women at different times and places. So Daly talks, for instance, about female genital mutilation and modern gynecology as part of this CEDAW ritual syndrome, which is to do with purity, tradition, ritual, and using women as token torturers. So it's certainly, there's certainly aspects of the witch hunts that do fit that. But Hester feels that Daly doesn't quite get what's going on. It's a bit too idealistic and comes from a religious viewpoint, which of course is very, that is where Mary Daly is coming from. So Daly saw the attacks very much as an attack on women who were refusing marriage, spinsters and widows as independent women, and that they were targeted for being a sort of spiritual and knowledgeable elite with, sort of spiritual wisdom, knowledge of healing. But Hester says we can't assume that single women and widows are taking a stand against marriage and male supremacy. It can just be circumstances. Some will certainly be marriage resistors, but there's no conclusive evidence from the trial materials. So Daly's obviously correct in seeing the witch hunt as an example of male and female conflict, an attack on women. But Hester suggests it's because it was to do with, yes, it was to do with independence, but it was because how that independence was seen as threatening the social order and in terms of the economic conflicts between men and women at this time. Because single women with children are a threat to the male social order, even if they haven't chosen to be single parents. They're outside of male control and showing alternative ways to live. Daly suggests that the independence of widows meant they were threatening. Hester suggests that there were also an economic burden, because many widows would end up dependent on the parish for support and be seen as a burden. And if they did inherit money or a business from their husband, that's also a threat to men. So Hester feels you have to look at ideology and also the sort of material conflicts, day-to-day realities of conflict between men and women for resources at the village level. She also looks at some work from Carlson, who wrote about the New England trials, and she thinks that's getting more on the right line. It was that women that step outside the prescribed roles can only be doing that with the help of witchcraft because they're inferior. And they're also a link to sexual deviation, which could be sex outside marriage, children outside marriage. It could also be abortion and control of fertility, which does link back to the healers and midwives thesis. And I think possibly midwives were maybe targeted because they were assisting women to control their fertility, which is a major conflict between women and men to this day, as well as, or you know, as much as any economic conflict. So can we have yeah, no, we've got that slide. Sorry, I'm getting myself a bit mixed up. I'm going to, oh no, you can put it up. So I'm going to do now a bit more about what was actually said in the pamphlets about the women that were charged as witches, because I think it's very, you know, it's very interesting because it does really help to bring the women to life. There's 5 contemporary pamphlets that she looks at that give accounts of the trials. Now, obviously, we don't really know how accurate they are. We don't know if the person that wrote them was present or not. And when things are presented as the confession of the witch, we don't know whether those women did actually confess. We don't know whether this is what they said or whether their accusers are putting words into their mouth. But I think that, you know, I hope you'll also find them very interesting. So she looked at who these women were. 90% were women. There were some men accused, but they tended to be husbands of women that had been accused as witches. Most of the accused were over 40, so there were mainly older women. And most were married, but the number of widows and spinsters is disproportionate for the population. So widows and spinsters were more likely to be targeted, but married women were certainly targeted as well. So one of the women whose history I found interesting was called Elizabeth Francis, and she was actually tried as a witch twice, and was mentioned, and so she's mentioned in 2 different pamphlets, one concerning each trial. So the first time she was imprisoned, but the second time she was sadly sentenced to death for causing death by witchcraft. And this first trial is in 1566. Yes, the question about the animals and what is she feeding them. Yeah, this is a witch with her familiars. They look like they may be toads. There were various animals that women were accused of harbouring. Toads, cats, dogs, ferrets lambs are all mentioned at different times as being familiars. Sometimes they feed them milk, sometimes they're alleged to feed them blood, you know, allow them to either the witch to prick herself and get bits of blood, or even to allow the animal to sort of suckle from what was called a witch's teat. So it's a very clear accusation, yeah, common accusation, and that clearly shows it. There's pictures in these pamphlets. I mean, I couldn't get hold of the actual pamphlets, but if there are, you know, if you search online, there are pictures that have been taken from these pamphlets. But something I read suggested that a lot of these, they're not actually portraits from life of the actual women. It's the equivalent of a stock photo. They're just sort of standard woodcuts of women that could be used to illustrate various texts. So poor Elizabeth was accused of bewitching an infant and causing paralysis, and her sister and niece were tried alongside her. Agnes Waterhouse, her sister, was hanged at that point, and Joan, the niece, who was only 18, was acquitted. So the pamphlet gives details of Elizabeth's so-called confession, and it's got many of the typical features that are included. So the women were accused of having a familiar or a spirit, which kind of links them to the devil, named Satan. I mean, it's actually spelt in the pamphlet Sathan, so I'm not entirely sure how you say it. Satan, Sathan. And so the spirit takes different forms, and that includes a cat with white spots, a toad, and a dog. And so obviously, I mean, many women would have had cats and dogs and lambs. You know, maybe I can't see any reason for her keeping a toad about the house, but you know, it just shows, you know, it's very easy, you know, a woman with a cat could come under suspicion. And it was the evidence of Joan that the familiar existed, because she acknowledged it existed, but in terms of her accusations, she denied using it for harm, that was used to convict the other women. And that, again, that's a common thing that comes up, the use of children to incriminate their mothers. And there is a family link between with witchcraft, because Elizabeth said that she was taught witchcraft from her mother, and it was believed to run in families. So if your mother had been accused as a witch, it increased the risk of you being accused as a witch. And certainly in the pamphlets, there's women where it is mentioned that they had you know, a relative, a mother or other relative that had also been charged as a witch. So Elizabeth believed she had this power of witchcraft, and what she was wanting to use it for was to improve her life. So first of all, she asked Satan for 18 sheep, which he gave her, but then the sheep disappeared. So she tried again, and this time she asked for a rich husband, and specifically a man who was named Andrew Biles. And Satan told her, and this is the quote from the pamphlet, that she should consent that this Andrew should abuse her first. So I to have sex with him first, and which she did, but he then refused to marry her. And I think in the context of thinking about rape more broadly, she should consent that this Andrew should abuse her is a very interesting use of the word consent, and shows how it is not a straightforward concept for women to use. It's pretty meaningless. Now, so she was in what was then a common predicament for women, because premarital sex was forbidden but widespread. So Elizabeth decided to get her revenge on him. First of all, she willed Satan to make him impotent, but then she also got him to kill him. And at that point, she feared that she was pregnant. So she took advice from Satan, who told her which herbs she could drink to cause an abortion. So we've got a woman seemingly hoping to use magic to improve her life. Whether it does or not is a different thing. But there was a widespread belief in the use of magic for good as well as this time. We can see compulsory heterosexuality in her life, that you know, her only way out of poverty is marriage, but then there's a risk of abuse along with that, where you know, the man promises marriage and then leaves after he's had sex with her. And also the control of fertility, which is a continued source of conflict, you know, right up to today, as we know. But despite this, Elizabeth then asked Satan for another husband. And again, there was sex and pregnancy prior to the marriage, but this time the man stayed around. But the pamphlet goes on to say, they lived not so quietly as she desired, being stirred to so much unquietness and moved to swearing and cursing. And this could obviously be an example of domestic abuse. You know, we don't know who's swearing and cursing. We don't know, you know, what's really going on. And obviously today, you know, we get women who, you know, are victims of abuse and coercive control that eventually kill their husbands because of the pressure. They are the ones that go to prison. You know, there's been, you know, I'm sure we know of many cases that feminists have exposed and campaigned on. Some of the women have been able to exonerate themselves and be released. Others aren't. Now, the child seemed to have been a particular source of conflict, and so she asked Satan to kill it. And it's really hard to know what actually happened here. Was it infanticide? But there was a really high infant mortality rate, and her accusers could just be attributing a natural death to the devil. You know, we don't really know what she thought about it. We don't know how far she was coerced to say these things. So her next act was to change Satan from a cat to a toad so that he could hide in her husband's shoe to bite him and make him lame. So this one she doesn't kill, allegedly. She just makes life difficult for him. She is accused of causing death by witchcraft, but it doesn't go. It's apparently a child, and it doesn't go into actually what that case was. But I think the relationships with the two men, you know, really show that what women were up against at that time. And the final proof that she is a witch comes from the so-called witch marks, which are red spots on the body or lumps, where she pricks herself to feed blood to Satan the cat. But many women in middle age and beyond will have strange marks and, you know, scars and whatever on their bodies. You know, we live our lives and things happen to us. So Elizabeth gets away with imprisonment at this point, but she's accused again in 1579 alongside 9 other women and 1 man. And this time she is accused of murder and is hanged. And this trial brings out how the everyday activities of borrowing and lending between neighbours can lead to accusations of women. Now, this time, Elizabeth has fallen out with her neighbour, who's Alice Poole. She asks Alice for some yeast. That Alice refuses, and so Elizabeth curses her. She's alleged to have summoned a spirit in the form of a small, noisy white dog. That was the one on the pamphlet that I showed you. This results in a pain in the head and eventually death. And again, the death could have been from natural causes. Elizabeth admits to using the spirit, but not to killing her. And Elizabeth then goes on to incriminate others, and this was frequent in trials and causes some to say that this means it's not an example of male domination over women. But of course, there's many reasons why women choose to side with men and betray other women. Self-protection, obviously. And, you know, due to being fear of targeting themselves, or maybe by then accusing others, a woman might hope for a lighter sentence. We don't know, but I mean, we all know it happens today. You know, many women are anti-feminist and will side with men. And then the other women that were tried alongside her at this time, again, economics does feature in this. So, but specifically between women and men, conflict, you know, between men doesn't result in witchcraft accusations, and situations where sort of men do harm to women as a result of these sorts of conflicts don't result in witchcraft accusations. It's a one-way street. So Elaine Smith, who, interesting again, is the daughter of an executed witch. Elaine Smith and her stepfather fall out over Elaine's inheritance from her mother. The stepfather dies and Elaine is blamed. Again, could be natural causes. There's a woman who's just named as Mother Staunton, and she has 11 different charges of witchcraft made against her. And they're all related to her requesting and being refused items from her neighbours, just simple things, yeast, milk. And when she denied, she curses them, and subsequently disaster strikes, illness of children, death of livestock. And it seems she has a reputation as a witch, so all her actions are seen as witchcraft, and she could be blamed for any misfortunes that happen. But despite all these charges, she is acquitted. Now, there's one woman in the various women that are talked about here who is actually specifically named as a midwife and a healer, and her name was Ursula Kemp. But she wasn't tried for practicing midwifery or healing. The accusations relate to things related to her work as a midwife. So Ursula was tried in 1582, again in Essex near Clacton. And she's a single woman with an illegitimate son. And she's another woman who attracts multiple accusations over fairly mundane incidents. Grace Thurlow is one of her main accusers. And it seems that Grace has previously worked for Grace as a midwife and a wet nurse, but they fall out when her services aren't required for Grace's latest pregnancy. So Grace accuses Ursley of being known as a witch. Of this, what the phrase actually is used is having a naughty name. And I looked it up, and at this time, naughty meant wicked with sexual connotations. So it's a serious accusation to throw at somebody, and you know, it's suggesting she is seen as somebody that's potentially a witch, evil, and sexually deviant. So Grace becomes lame and she blames Ursley. Now, Ursley at this point claims that she doesn't know how to remove spells. She can unwitch people, but not bewitch them. And so she says that she'll cure Grace for a fee of 12 pence, which she does, but Grace doesn't pay. So when Grace falls ill again, and her child does, she blames Ursley. Now, Ursley, giving her evidence, says that at one point she herself had been lame and had been told by another woman that she was bewitched and how to unwitch herself. And so she does do a sort of, she describes a ritual that involves the use of herbs and of magic. Can take hog's dung and chervil and put them together and hold them in her left hand, and to take in the other hand a knife, and to prick the medicine 3 times, and then to cast the same into the fire, and to take the knife and make 3 pricks under the table, and to let the knife stick there. And after that, to take 3 leaves of sage and as much herb John, and put them into ale, and drink it last at night and first in the morning. So this is the idea of the white witch, the healer, that can use a mix of herbal remedies and magic for good, for healing. But obviously there's a very fine line between being seen to do things for good and do things for evil. Because if your healing doesn't work, and then somebody dies as a result, then that could be blamed on you. As I say, so she's not charged for being a healer or a midwife per se, but for harm done to children who died, which I guess would be a risk for any midwife at that time due to the high infant mortality rate. And sadly, she is executed for death by witchcraft. And again, she's accused of having familiars, and her 8-year-old son is used to give evidence against her to name the spirits. There was Tiffy, a grey cat, and Tiffy, a white lamb, and Jack, a black cat, and they suck her blood at night. And again, that's a kind of, there's a connotation of sexual deviance there. That this animal is sort of sucking your blood at night. It's there's a lot of sexual imagery in there. We're getting on. One of the last ones I'm going to talk about. This is an interesting one. This is accusations of witchcraft could be used against women seen to be sexually deviant. So we've seen premarital sex and children outside of marriage. But this case is actually potentially seems to be the accusation of a lesbian relationship. The woman is called Elizabeth Bennet, and a man called William Bonner accuses her of killing his wife and suggests that there may have been a lesbian relationship between them. They said Elizabeth Bennet and his wife were lovers and familiar friends and did accompanies much together. And when his wife became sick, he said that Elizabeth clasped her in her arms and killed her. And Hester says it's difficult to understand exactly what happened here and whether or not sexual intimacy is implied, because we've got very little research on ideas of lesbianism at this time. And women could have more physical contact in the past without it being seen as sexual. But Elizabeth was also accused by another neighbour of being an old whore. So she's obviously a woman that is seen as sexually inappropriate. And the targeting of poor women was very much in the context of asking for alms or begging. So, for instance, there was a woman called Joan Prentice who lived in an almshouse and went asking also for money and fuel. And she was accused of raising a wind to uproot a tree when she needed wood. So the old traditions of sort of borrowing and exchanging and helping out neighbours seemed to be faded as the money economy was coming in, and those seen as needing help were now seen as suspicious. So we're then moving on to the conclusions. So the witch hunts constituted sexual violence against women in the sense that the vast majority of those persecuted were women, and it was only by constructing women as inferior to men in a sexual way that women became the primary targets of witch accusation. So the risk factors for being a witch, what a main one was sexual deviance, children outside marriage, being seen as a whore or another lewd woman, possibly a lesbian. There was a disproportionate number of widows and single women outside male control, suggestions of abortion and infanticide, and potential domestic abuse. So sexuality-related conflicts between women and men. And then also related to that, the economic conflict, where everyday behaviours like asking to borrow something can lead to an accusation. The need to marry to survive because of compulsory heterosexuality, and being seen as an unwanted burden, unproductive, past childbearing age, and just a drain. Which again, you can see very much in ideas of women around getting welfare benefits. There's still ideas of single mothers like that, targeting homeless people. It still happens. Oh, excuse me. So yeah, witch hunts will continue. Yeah, I've read that, haven't I? So we'll have the next one, and then we're getting there. So the mechanisms. I'm just going to have to. I have had a cold for the past few days and hay fever, so I'm getting a bit. So this is one of the Hester's conclusions, that the mechanisms involved in the dynamics of domination remain the same. Sex and violence, but new forms result from the ongoing conflictual relations between men and women at many different levels, and from the attempt by men to maintain power over women. And one of the reasons she suggests that the witchcraft trials declined was because of this new Protestant ideology of women, that women were passive, they were domestic, they weren't sexual. You know, this is at the start of that kind of Victorian idea of women as completely uninterested, not sexual beings. So eventually it seemed to be an easier way, rather than having to go through all these trials and imprisoning women and executions. And it was actually much simpler in the end to reconstruct the ideology and social expectations on a woman from being sexually insatiable, from being active, powerful, and with the ability to use magic, to a submissive creature that stayed at home, that was just involved in childcare, didn't have any powers. And she also points out that this is a cross-class male cooperation, because it was the upper class men that ran the law courts, and so accusations could be made in a village between residents of the village, between women who are neighbours, but the ruling class needed to intervene. So it shows how that the old and poor were easy targets, but it required cross-class cooperation between men and women to really remove these women from being a threat. And that's not saying that the witch hunts happened due to capitalism. They happened as during the transition to capitalism, men acted to maintain their economic dominance, because male supremacy, it predates capitalism. And even as capitalism is coming, is changing in communist societies, it never went away, did it? So I think I am going to have to well, there's one more slide. I think no, one or two more slides. One more slide. So there has been a memorial now to these so-called witches of Essex. And this is a photograph of it that I found online. So, you know, it says it's in memory of the victims of the Essex witch hunts who were imprisoned in Colchester Castle. This is in the grounds of Colchester Castle. But I don't know whether you can read lower down, but it says it was as a result of superstition, ignorance, and hysteria. Whereas I think it's not just that; it is, you know, targeting women, and it is an example of male violence. So I think I am going to have to stop now, and I hope that was interesting. I can see there's been loads and loads of stuff in the chat. So thank you everybody, and I look forward to reading that.
I'm just asking Sheila to join you for a second and
Yeah.
to add some thoughts because of the work you did, Sheila, with Marianne Hester. So and then it will give your voice a break. So Sheila.
Thanks very much. Absolutely fascinating, Dorothea. Goodness me, all the wonderful stuff you put in there. Yes, I just wanted to say that the analysis that fuels this book, which is the revolutionary feminist analysis of sexuality being a fundamental, if not the main mechanism of male domination, was developed in the late 1970s in a group in which Marianne and I both were. A lot of us were PhD students in the group. It was called the Patriarchy Study Group. And it was started, I think, about 78. What was fascinating is that we met as a group in each other's homes for the weekend, and we'd stay over in each other's homes and spend 2 days developing our ideas, developing the analysis, which is something which is quite hard, I think, to imagine now. But it worked really, really well. And in the end, after a couple of years, the group split up because some women in the group accused the others of us of concentrating too much on sexuality. And they didn't want to talk about sexuality. Sexuality wasn't as important as we made it. And the group split up with some acrimony. Some carried on and developed the analysis that fueled the book in 1982, which was the sexuality papers, which we haven't talked about, and maybe we will later on. But what's so fascinating is that analysis is still going strong. I use it still, of course, in all of my work. So though some women in the group wanted to sort of shut it up and said, no, don't do that, it's been enormously important. And it was obviously enormously important in Marianne's work as well. So I just wanted to say that we were developing wonderful ideas in those days. And I hope this will all happen again, that women will get together to develop ideas, because of course, we were all equal and we all shared our thoughts and developed the ideas together. It was a terrific process. And I do miss that. I mean, it developed into some women becoming, seen as the main women and writing books and so on. But at one time, we developed those ideas. And it's fascinating that in 92, and Marianne's still calling her analysis revolutionary feminist, because as feminism declined and there was a huge backlash against it, most of us who had been revolutionary feminists, I'm probably still using revolutionary feminism to describe myself at that time too, because the whole of revolutionary feminism was really based on this analysis and the importance of sexuality. But we do generally start calling ourselves radical feminists. Radical feminism is different. It doesn't focus on sexuality in the same way. So during the 1990s, we mostly stopped describing ourselves in that way. But at the time this book was written, the revolutionary feminist analysis of sexuality, as you make really, really clear, was really still tremendously important. And you've reminded me of that by talking about this book. So thanks very much for doing that.
You're welcome. Yeah, it was really interesting, and yeah, it'd be nice to have more history books that have that kind of analysis rather than just sort of here's some wonderful women. But yeah. Anyway, thank you. I will be opening the breakout room in a minute if you want to join me. And
yes. Thanks very much indeed. And to everybody who was in the chat saying all sorts of wonderful things, as they always do.
Yes, and I look forward to reading it. It's always good to see afterwards because you
Yeah.
can't keep up with it during the talk. So